She stood outside this bakery in a tattered wedding dress, offering it in exchange for a single loaf of bread. "Please," she whispered. But the baker turned her away. Humiliated, hungry, and alone, she sank into the dirt behind the train station, clutching the gown like a corpse. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind cut through the early light like a blade, curling around the corners of Dry Creek's narrow buildings, lifting grit and ash from the dirt roads and brushing against the windows like a breath withheld. Margaret stood in its path, motionless, her fingers pale and rigid around the folded weight of her wedding dress. The silence of mourning was not peaceful. It was expectant, as if even the sky held its breath, uncertain what to do with a woman who wore heartbreak like a shawl. The bakery door hadn't yet been unlocked, but she stood there anyway, not out of hope, but from a kind of stubborn refusal to vanish. Her cheeks burned with wind and humiliation, yet she held her head with the careful stillness of someone who refused to wilt, even after being stepped on. The dress pressed against her ribs, its lace once embroidered by another woman's hands, now fraying at the seams, too fine for use but too sacred to destroy. It had been meant for a celebration, a beginning. Now it was a currency no one would accept. Thomas Withers stepped out moments later, wiping his hands on his apron, eyes narrowed against the morning cold. His face softened when he saw her, not with affection, but with the kind of tired sympathy reserved for people you didn't have room to help. "I'll have no use for that, miss," he said, his voice rough but not cruel. "It's a nice piece, but flour costs silver. My youngest's got a cough." She nodded without protest. Margaret had learned not to argue with necessity. She looked at the loaves through the window, lined up in tight rows, golden, round, warm. Her stomach coiled in on itself like a clenched fist. She left the steps without a word. The wind caught her skirts as she turned, tugging her back like some invisible hand, begging her to stay, to plead. But pride walked ahead of her, chin lifted, dress gripped like a lifeline. The town, for all its quietness, watched her with every shuttered window and unlatched gate. She passed the mercantile, the blacksmith's forge, the chapel. No one greeted her. No one asked. That's what made it harder. Not the cruelty, but the indifference. To them, she was a woman who had arrived unannounced and already carried failure in her eyes. By the time she reached the edge of town, her feet numb and her throat raw from silence, Margaret lowered herself onto a wooden crate behind the station and rested the dress across her lap. Her fingers traced its seams, remembering how she once imagined it would trail across a church floor, not gather dirt behind a freight depot. She swallowed hard. The hunger in her belly was sharp, but it wasn't the worst thing gnawing at her. "I am still worth something," she whispered to the dress, but it didn't answer. Only the wind did, soft, like a lullaby sung to a child who would not sleep. The henhouse barely held its shape. Once whitewashed, now silvered by wind and time, it stood slightly askew on a patch of brittle grass and stubborn earth, just outside the town's edge. Margaret swept out the straw and droppings with her hands, laid down a square of burlap for decency, and tucked her wedding dress beneath her for warmth each night. It didn't smell like dreams anymore. It smelled faintly of damp feathers and sun-warmed fabric, but it was still hers, and she guarded it the way a widow might clutch the last letter from a lost love. The townsfolk pretended not to stare, but their glances, short, sharp, and silent, cut all the same. Women narrowed their eyes as she passed. Men looked away, too quickly. They called her the bride without a groom, or worse, the one who scared him off. As though Levi Callahan's silence had become her stain to bear. As though the shape of her body, The strength in her hands, her quiet refusal to break, were offenses. But Margaret had learned long ago that the world always finds something to sneer at in a woman who won't beg. She sewed. With nothing but a bent needle, a tin of dull pins, and what thread she could trade or scavenge, she began stitching herself into usefulness. The town's children wore her mended sleeves. The pastor's wife paid her in boiled potatoes and soap for cleaning pews. She didn't speak much, but she listened, through walls, across fences, over the wind. She knew who grieved, who drank, who beat their dog. And she carried it all like a stone beneath her ribs. The knowledge that everyone was cracked somewhere, and her cracks were simply on display. It was on a soft, skied morning, just as the sun melted frost from the fence posts, that Will Harris rode past her makeshift workspace. She was seated on a splintered stool near the boundary of his ranch, patching a saddlebag whose corner had torn clean open. Her fingers moved with sure rhythm, her jaw set in quiet concentration. She didn't look up when the horse stopped. "You stitch like my sister used to," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like he didn't expect conversation, only truth. She blinked once, then met his gaze. "Care to trade sewing for bread?" No questions. No pity. Just a transaction laced in mercy. That evening, the bread was still warm in her hands. Cornbread, golden and soft, its honey glaze catching the light like a promise. They sat on his porch in a silence so gentle it didn't need to be broken. When she rose to leave, he pressed a small sack into her hands, biscuits wrapped in a checkered cloth. "For tomorrow," he said. She walked back to the henhouse with the warmth of the meal still in her chest, and a quiet in her bones that for once did not feel like loneliness. Spring crept into Dry Creek not in bursts, but in quiet persistence, like someone returning home through the back door. Ice retreated from the riverbanks. Sparrows returned to the eaves. The wind lost its bite, though it still carried the smell of wood smoke and soil. And in the hush between chores and gossip, Margaret Wilkins began to piece herself back together, not loudly, not with pride, but the way one might mend a frayed hem, carefully, invisibly, stitch by hidden stitch. The henhouse, once barely fit for chickens, had softened under her touch. She scrubbed the floor with a rag until the planks showed hints of their old grain. She bundled dried lavender with string and tucked it between the rafters. Pine soap, gifted by the pastor's wife for kneading dough before service, left its sharp, clean scent clinging to her wash basin. It still wasn't home, not quite, but it was a place where she could breathe without flinching. Each night, she lit the same stub of candle beside her pallet. It was a quiet ritual, neither prayer nor habit, but something in between. The light flickered across the folds of the wedding dress, now folded neatly in the corner. She hadn't tried to sell it again. Somehow washing it had changed its meaning. It no longer waited for a man. It waited for her. Will Harris came by now and then, never announced, never lingering. A man of few words, he offered things instead of questions. A small tin of dried berries, a book of Emily Dickinson's poems so worn the cover curled back like a leaf, a plank to stop the draft from sliding under her door. She thanked him once. After that, she simply accepted. That seemed to be what he preferred. They didn't talk about her past, or his. Their silences were not hollow, but textured, like woven cloth, dense with meaning. They spoke in the ways people do when words feel too sharp for the softness between them. A nod, a glance, a hand brushed against wood grain as one handed the other something simple, like a tin or a cup. One morning, as she rinsed sheets in a basin, the breeze lifted them like flags. The wedding dress hung among them, its ivory catching the sun for the first time in months. Will stopped on his ride and tilted his head toward it. "Yours?" he asked. She paused, wringing water from a linen towel. It used to mean something, she said quietly. He looked at the fabric, then at her. Still does. Then he turned and left, his horse kicking up the dust with calm deliberation. But before the wind could fully carry his presence away, she noticed it. A small parcel wrapped in brown paper resting beside the dress on the line. She opened it to find a warm apple tart, its crust golden and flaking, the scent of cinnamon rising like memory. That night, she didn't sit by the candle alone. She sat across from the dress, broke the tart into quarters, and ate slowly. Not out of hunger, but because the sweetness felt like something rare and unspoken, something like being seen. The sun settled soft and golden over Dry Creek, as if it, too, had been waiting for something gentle to arrive. The spring fair spilled across the common field like a quilt, patched with hay bales, checkered blankets, and hand-sewn bunting that fluttered in the warm breeze. Laughter lilted through the air, sharp, high, and unthinking, rising above the music of fiddles and stomping boots. The scent of roasted corn and molasses lingered between the stalls. It was a day made for forgetting. Margaret Wilkins did not forget. She stepped onto the field with her shoulders back, her spine straight, and the wedding dress cinched at the waist with a strip of faded calico. It no longer shimmered. It no longer clung to the fantasy of ivory aisleways or murmured vows. Its hem was frayed. A button at the sleeve had been replaced with wood, and still it held her upright like armor woven from the ruins of hope. She wore it not to be admired, but to be whole. People noticed. Of course they did. The whispers were quiet, but not kind. She's wearing it again. Does she think that poor man will take her? What nerve. Margaret heard them, and she didn't flinch. Not when Levi Callahan swaggered past with his young, blushing wife, her corset too tight, her smile too sweet. Not even when Levi smirked, half a greeting, half a wound, and tipped his hat like he still had the right to mock what he once discarded. Margaret held her ground. And then Will Harris appeared. His gait was steady, boots dusted from the road, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He carried nothing but a single wildflower in his calloused hand, blue as a promise and crooked at the stem. He said nothing at first, only looked at her the way one looks at a hill they never thought they'd climb, and found themselves grateful to have done it. "I thought," he said at last, quiet enough that only she could hear, "you might save me a dance." She blinked, the wind catching the dress as she glanced down at it. "Even in this?" she asked, the hint of self-consciousness almost hidden. He smiled, not with amusement, but with reverence. "Especially in that. It's the bravest dress I've ever seen." She let him take her hand, and in the square of trampled grass between the cider barrels and the fiddler's stage, they moved, not with rhythm, but with grace, the grace of two people who had been broken where no one could see and had grown back slowly, quietly, like trees in the dark. They did not speak as the dance ended. They didn't need to. But under the shade of the cider tent, when the music softened and the sun dipped lower, Will leaned in and whispered, not as a question, but a vow. "You tried to trade your wedding dress for bread. If you'll let me, I'll feed you for the rest of my life." Margaret's eyes didn't shine. They steadied. She touched the fabric at her waist, then looked at him, her voice simple and certain. "Then I guess I'll stop saving this dress."